let's zoom into a couple of the main contentions with Dr. White. So let's continue down that route. So, what's the next point you'd like to respond to in regards to something that he said?
He said something to the effect that Molinism was never derived from Scripture.
Okay.
Gosh,
which is the biggest issue for Calvinists, and which was linked to my personal study. I think there's an answer to why many Molinists today come off as being overly philosophical and not as biblical as many Calvinists would feel comfortable with. I'm not saying that it's necessarily wrong or anything like that. All truth is God's truth, and if something's philosophically coherent, it's philosophically coherent, and it's true if it reflects the Scriptures. But when I studied Molinism, I felt like it felt like it was an attempt to answer a theological and philosophical puzzle as opposed to something that is derived from the text. It's almost as though it's something that can fit with the text when you're trying to answer this question, but not so much derived from the text itself. Now, real quick before you interject, and I'm sure, and I'm excited to hear how you would respond to that, because I'm not the only one who feels that way. It's my idea, or kind of my understanding, that because Molinism has been popularized by Alvin Plantinga and William Lane Craig, and it comes primarily through the philosophical works of Molina, that when people catch on to Molinism from a popular level, that's their exposure to it. As Dr. McGregor said when I spoke with him a few years back, he said that a lot of Molina's works in regard to his biblical defenses haven't been published. And so when people learn about Molina, they're coming at it primarily from that philosophical bent, and then they latch onto that, and that's kind of how Molinism is presented, this purely philosophical perspective. And so how would you kind of respond to something like that and kind of put some Calvinists at ease and say, wait a second, there's some biblical, support here, because that's definitely something that we struggle with.
Yeah, that's a great point. How Molinism has been popularized might have actually done some damage in that sense. So I think that's you might be onto something there. Molina himself, I can't remember how many pages. I think it was 60-some pages is what he started with of biblical data. So he started with biblical data as his foundation. And when it comes to my dissertation, which is focused on this subject, the first chapter is all about key concepts. And really, I spent a bunch of time regarding hermeneutics and how to have a logically consistent hermeneutic. And if you want truth, Christianity is true. It will always be logical because truth and logic are inextricably linked. You can't have one without the other. That doesn't mean we'll always be able to, connect all the logical dots. But that doesn't mean the logical dots aren't out there to be connected. So, and maybe you'll disagree with this, but it seems to me that both Molinism and Calvinism are both philosophical attempts to try to make sense of biblical data. But maybe there's some pushback there. But I guess I would say, I start out in my dissertation talking about how to do a correct hermeneutic that I believe, especially that Calvinists are going to affirm. Second, I go through all the biblical data. Well, maybe not all of it, but I have a really long second chapter. And I start out by looking at all the verses that might, influence one to affirm determinism or exhaustive divine determinism, which many Calvinists affirm. And then I look at all the verses that might lend to somebody saying, no, we have a real ability to choose between a range of options, each compatible with our image of God nature, limited libertarian freedom. And then I look at some that even some that apply determinism when it comes to salvation, some that even imply libertarian freedom when it comes to salvation issues. And I don't, in the second chapter, I don't try to make any conclusions. I just have all these categories, and look, there's biblical data across the board that, there's biblical data, both Old and New Testament, that the determinists can point to. And there's biblical data, both Old and New Testament, that the libertarian freedom fighter can point to.
You
And
made
so
the libertarian sound so much more noble.
That's right. Sorry about that.
We're the empire. You're the rebels.
Yeah, oh man. So I mean, so ultimately, I say these are either contradictions, which nobody wants to affirm, right? I don't affirm that, and I know James White wouldn't affirm it either, and I know you wouldn't. But I say you gotta have a view, or you can't promote a view that doesn't make sense of all of them. And so I believe that this philosophical view of Molinism, when you view the entirety of Scripture through that lens, it makes sense of the whole thing. It can make sense of every passage. And I don't think a deterministic view, an exhaustive divine deterministic view, whether it be Calvinism or any other view like that, I don't think that's going to work across the board. It will make sense of big chunks of Scripture. I don't think it will for all of it. But I do think Molinism is biblical. I do make that case then in my dissertation. And I've got a relatively short top-level beginner's article on my website called Molinism Is Biblical, where I go through the passages of Scripture that would affirm both God's counterfactual knowledge and human limited libertarian freedom. And then I say, okay, if God's got counterfactual knowledge, and if he has that knowledge, now this is philosophical here, because the Bible doesn't say God possesseth middle knowledge, right? But it doesn't say God possesseth. Right. But so you've got to take, and it doesn't say God possesseth natural or free knowledge either, which we'll get into soon. And I know Dr. White will say that God has. So you look at the biblical data, and then you try to think about it logically, which is simply what it means to make philosophical sense of it. We're thinking about it logically. How do you logically make the most sense of all the biblical data from Genesis to Revelation? And so that's my goal. And I'm not a philosopher. I'm a systematic theologian who takes philosophy and logic quite seriously. So I just think that Christians should be not just committed to excellent theology and biblical exegesis and hermeneutics, but also committed to logic and good philosophy, not shallow philosophy, but good God-honoring philosophy that makes sense of biblical data. Yeah,
I think it's important for, and I'm not saying that I agree with your explanations necessarily. Right. We're giving an opportunity for you to share your thoughts, and definitely I will continue to think about these things. Yeah. But I think a lot of Calvinists need to understand, because stereotypically speaking, Calvinists tend to be biblically minded. I'll say stereotypically, because we have our philosophies as well and things like that.
Right.
But we need to be very careful to talk down against philosophy, because the Bible does not teach that we should avoid philosophy. Rather, it teaches us to avoid a particular kind of philosophy, a philosophy that is according to worldly principles and things like that. Now, is Molinism that? That's the argument. Is Calvinism that? That's the argument. And so that's why we have these discussions. But we don't avoid philosophical reflection. We can't pow, give the tap on the hands of the Molinists for using logical priority and things like that. But then the Calvinist gets away with speaking about supralapsarianism and all these other sorts of things. So we have to play fair in these kinds of discussions. But go ahead. What were you going to continue on? Go ahead.
Well, that's just well said. I think that's one of the reasons why you and I get along so well. But and you mentioned this. We should probably, for those of your listeners who might be new to this conversation, we need to explain what middle